The winter of 1946 was one of the harshest Europe had seen in decades. Snow blanketed the ruins of German cities, settling on broken buildings and shattered lives. The war had been over for months, but peace had not brought relief. In those bitter months, survival was the only victory that mattered. In a small town in the British occupation zone, a German mother named Emma stood outside a military checkpoint. Her hands were raw from the cold, her coat threadbare and patched in multiple places. She held the hand of her young daughter, Anna, who was perhaps 6 years old, thin as a rail, with hollow eyes that had seen too much for such a tender age. Behind them stood Emma's son, Klaus, barely 8, trying to be brave despite the hunger gnawing at his belly. Emma had heard that sometimes the British soldiers distributed food. Not often, and not to everyone, but sometimes. It was worth the walk through the snow, worth the wait in the freezing cold, worth the humiliation of begging. Her children hadn't had a proper meal in days. The rations were never enough, and there was nothing left to trade, nothing left to sell. She approached the checkpoint hesitantly. 2 British soldiers stood guard, their uniforms clean and pressed, their faces ruddy from the cold but otherwise healthy and well-fed. The contrast between them and the German civilians shuffling past was stark. Emma gathered her courage and stepped forward. "Please," she said in broken English, her voice barely above a whisper. "My children. Food, please." One of the soldiers, a young man with red hair and freckles, looked at her with an expression that might have been pity or might have been annoyance. It was hard to tell. He shook his head curtly. "Move along," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "No handouts today." Emma's heart sank, but she tried again. "Please, they are hungry, so hungry." She gestured to Anna and Klaus, who stood behind her, their eyes downcast. The second soldier, older and broader with a thick mustache, stepped forward. His face was harder, less sympathetic. "You heard him. Move along, we've got orders." But Emma couldn't move. Her feet seemed frozen to the ground, and not just from the cold. She had walked 3 miles to get here. Her children's faces haunted her. She had failed them already in so many ways, she couldn't fail them again. "Just a little bread," she pleaded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Anything, please." The younger soldier shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at his companion, then back at Emma. For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar, one from his own rations. He held it out toward Anna. But before the little girl could take it, the older soldier's hand shot out and grabbed his companion's wrist. "What do you think you're doing, Jenkins?" he said sharply. "Come on, Sergeant, look at them. They're starving," Jenkins protested. "I can see that. But we have orders. You start handing out your rations and tomorrow there'll be 100 people here. Then 1,000. Where does it end?" Jenkins pulled his hand back, the chocolate bar disappearing back into his pocket. Emma's face crumpled. She turned away, taking her children's hands, preparing to make the long walk home through the snow with nothing to show for it. They had gone perhaps 20 paces when they heard footsteps crunching rapidly through the snow behind them. Emma tensed, afraid they were about to be yelled at or worse. But when she turned, she saw a third soldier jogging toward them, someone who hadn't been at the checkpoint moments before. He must have been inside the building. This soldier was different from the others. He was older, probably in his 30s, with dark hair graying at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of having seen too much. His uniform bore the insignia of a sergeant major, and there was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. "Wait," he called out. When he reached them, he stopped, slightly out of breath, clouds of vapor puffing from his mouth in the cold air. He looked at Emma, then at her children, studying their faces for a long moment. Anna stared up at him with those hollow eyes, and something in the soldier's expression shifted. "Come with me," he said simply. Emma hesitated. She didn't know what this meant. Was she in trouble? Were they going to be arrested? But the soldier's face, though stern, wasn't cruel, and she had nothing left to lose. "It's all right," he said more gently, seeing her fear. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." He led them around the side of the building to a small storage facility, Using a key from his belt, he unlocked the door and gestured for them to step inside. The room was warmer than outside, and Emma could see it was stocked with supplies, canned goods, bags of flour, boxes of dried milk, and other provisions. The sergeant major moved quickly, pulling items from the shelves. A loaf of bread, still fresh, 2 cans of meat, a tin of condensed milk, a bag of sugar. He piled them into Emma's arms, then grabbed a blanket from another shelf and wrapped it around Anna's thin shoulders. "This is not official," he said quietly. "Do you understand? You didn't get this from me. You found it, or a friend gave it to you. But you didn't get it from a British soldier. Are we clear?" Emma nodded, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." But the sergeant major wasn't finished. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Klaus and Anna. From his pocket, he pulled out 2 chocolate bars, the good kind, with nuts and caramel. He placed one in each child's hand. "These are for you," he said. "Not for later, for right now. Go ahead." Klaus looked at his mother for permission. When she nodded through her tears, both children tore into the chocolate with desperate hunger. The sergeant major watched them for a moment, his jaw tight, then stood and turned back to Emma. "There's a church about a mile east of here," he said. "St. Michael's. The priest there, Father Brennan. He's Irish, neutral during the war. He runs a soup kitchen 3 days a week. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Go there. Tell him Sergeant Major Crawford sent you. He'll make sure you get a meal." Emma could barely speak. "Why?" she finally managed. "Why are you doing this?" Crawford was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. "I have a daughter," he said. "Back in Manchester. She's about your girl's age. Maybe a bit younger." He paused, swallowing hard. "When I look at your children, I see her. And I think, if things had gone differently, if Germany had won, if Britain had been occupied, would someone show my daughter kindness? Would someone feed her when she was hungry?" He shook his head, as if clearing away the thought. "The war's over. We're all just trying to survive now. Go on. Get your children home before it gets dark." Emma wanted to say more, wanted to express the depth of her gratitude, but words failed her. She simply clutched the supplies to her chest, gathered her children, and hurried away before anyone could stop them or take back what had been given. The walk home seemed shorter, despite the burden of the supplies. Anna and Klaus walked with slightly more energy, the chocolate having given them a momentary boost. Emma's mind raced. She could make soup tonight. Real soup with meat and vegetables. The children would have full bellies for the first time in weeks. And the information about the church, that was perhaps more valuable than the food itself. A reliable source of meals could mean the difference between life and death in the months ahead. When they reached their small apartment in a half-destroyed building, Emma immediately set about preparing food. She used some of the canned meat and made a thick broth with potatoes she had been saving. The smell filled their tiny space, and both children sat at the table, watching their mother work with expressions of hope and anticipation they hadn't shown in months. As they ate that night, Emma told them about the British soldiers' kindness. She wanted them to remember that even in the darkest times, even when hatred and suspicion divided nations and peoples, individual acts of compassion could shine through. She wanted them to remember that enemies on a battlefield could be human beings with families and hearts once the fighting stopped. "Remember his name," she told them. "Sergeant Major Crawford. Remember what he did for us." The next Tuesday, Emma took her children to St. Michael's Church. The building had survived the war relatively intact, though there were cracks in the walls and several windows had been replaced with boards. Inside, they found a line of people, all thin, all desperate, all waiting for food. Father Brennan, a round man with kind eyes and a thick Irish brogue, moved among them offering encouragement and comfort. When Emma reached the front of the line, she mentioned Crawford's name as instructed. Father Brennan's face lit up. "Ah, so he's sent another family my way, has he? That man's got a heart bigger than all of Britain. Come, come, let's get you fed." Over the following weeks, Emma brought her children to the church regularly. The meals were simple but nourishing. Potato soup, bread, sometimes a bit of cheese or sausage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive. to give them strength to face another day. She saw Crawford once more, several weeks later. She had returned to the checkpoint to thank him properly, to tell him that his kindness had made all the difference. She found him overseeing a delivery of supplies, checking items off on a clipboard. When he saw her, he looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said quietly. "I had to thank you," Emma replied. "You saved my children's lives." Crawford looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just gave you some food. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Emma said firmly. "Not anyone. Most wouldn't. You did." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. "This was my mother's. I want you to have it." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small silver cross on a delicate chain. It was one of the last valuable things she owned, something she had managed to keep hidden throughout the war and the chaos that followed. "I can't take that," Crawford protested. "Please," Emma insisted. "Give it to your daughter. Tell her it's from a little German girl who lived because her father was kind. Tell her that kindness matters, even when the world is dark." Crawford stared at the cross for a long moment, then carefully took it from her hand. "I'll give it to her," he promised. "And I'll tell her the story. I'll tell her about a brave mother who walked through the snow to feed her children, and about how sometimes the best way to win a war is to remember our humanity." In the months that followed, Germany began its slow recovery. The extreme shortages eased slightly. People began to rebuild, both their cities and their lives. Emma found work cleaning offices in the British sector, and though the pay was modest, it was enough to feed her family. Klaus and Anna started attending school again, their cheeks gradually filling out, their eyes losing that hollow, haunted look. Emma never forgot Crawford's kindness, and she made sure her children never forgot either. She taught them that compassion knows no national boundaries, that even former enemies can show mercy, and that one person's choice to act with humanity can ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. Years later, when Klaus was a young man, he became a teacher. He often told his students about that winter, about the British soldier who helped his family when they had nothing. He used it as an example of how individual actions matter, how choosing kindness over indifference can change lives, how the true victory is not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who refuse to let hatred consume them. Anna became a nurse, dedicating her life to healing and helping others. When people asked why she chose such a demanding profession, she would sometimes tell them about the winter of 1946, about being so hungry she could barely stand, about a chocolate bar given freely by a man who had every reason to hate Germans but chose compassion instead. Crawford himself returned to Manchester after his service ended. He gave his daughter the Silver Cross just as he had promised and told her the story. She wore it every day, a reminder of her father's kindness and of the German mother and children whose lives he had touched. She would eventually pass it on to her own daughter, and the story would be passed down through the generations, a small testament to humanity's capacity for good even in the darkest times. The checkpoint where Emma first begged for food is gone now, demolished decades ago. The storage room where Crawford gave her supplies has long since been torn down. Even St. Michael's Church, which served so many hungry people in those desperate years, was eventually replaced by a more modern building. The physical places have vanished, but the memory remains, preserved in the hearts of those who lived through those times and passed the story to their children. This is what Emma wanted her children to understand: that the world is changed not by grand gestures or famous deeds, but by small acts of kindness performed by ordinary people who simply choose to see the humanity in others. A loaf of bread, a can of meat, a chocolate bar, a name of a church where food could be found. These simple things were everything when there was nothing else. In the end, what shocked Emma most was not that someone had helped her, but that someone who had fought against her country, who had lost friends and comrades to German soldiers, who had every justification for bitterness and revenge, chose instead to see past the uniform of enemy to the reality of a mother trying desperately to feed her starving children. That was the real miracle of that frozen winter day. Not the food itself, but the recognition that on both sides of the war, there were human beings deserving of compassion and dignity. And sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, from the most unexpected sources, That compassion would shine through, bright as a candle in the darkness, warming hearts that had grown cold with despair.